Joining us today is an NFL player turned civil rights lawyer, now congressman, representing Texas's 32nd district. That's up in the Northeast Dallas area. He's originally from Brownsville, but now he's running for the Democratic nomination, looking to ultimately unseat Senator Ted Cruz in 2024. Please welcome Congressman Colin Allred. Thanks for joining us today, Congressman.
Thanks for having me, Rudy. I'll just say one thing. My family's from Brownsville.
Sorry,
I was
family
actually
from
born and raised
Brownsville.
in Dallas.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry about that.
That's
He's
fine.
got ties to Brownsville.
Yeah, that's right.
That's an important part down here.
I know you do too.
So tell us a little bit about why you're running for Senate.
Yeah. Well, I'm running because we can't afford 6 more years of Ted Cruz in the United States Senate. He's somebody who I think has pitted us against each other, who's not done the job in many ways that we elected him to do, to pass legislation to help Texans. I have a very different story. I was raised by a single mother in Dallas who's a public school teacher. I graduated from our public schools. I went to Baylor and, as you said, had a chance to play in the NFL and serve in the Obama administration. And I believe in our state. I'm a 4th-generation Texan, but I also believe that it doesn't have to be this way. I just was named the most bipartisan member of our delegation. It is possible for us to work together to get things done, and we don't have to have a senator who just pits us against each other.
You know, speaking of bipartisanship, immigration in the last few months here, we've seen the end of Title 42.
Yeah.
Biden administration changed some enforcement policies, and we've seen a dramatic drop in illegal crossings, but those numbers are still high. Now we have the state stepping in and trying to do their own enforcement with those border buoys, Governor Abbott's Operation Lone Star. How do you begin to use that bipartisan skill that you have to kind of start solving some of our immigration issues?
Yeah. Well, I reject the idea that we have to be inhumane in order to secure our border. But I also know that part of the problem here is that the federal government has not acted. We haven't had a comprehensive immigration reform since Ronald Reagan was in the White House. And it's possible for us to find a way forward. I've working on some bipartisan legislation with Veronica Escobar, Congresswoman from El Paso, that will help us address our border security, but also allow our immigration system to better meet the needs of our economy, which I think, for the folks I represent in North Texas, I hear about all the time. And so we can do this. We have the framework in place, and there are honestly folks like John Cornyn who I think do want to do something about this. The problem we have is we have senators also like Ted Cruz who want to use this as a political issue and want to come to the Valley and use it as a political backdrop to go on kind of a safari and point out problems instead of actually trying to work to find a way forward to actually pass legislation to help fix some of these problems.
You know, one of the things you just mentioned there was the economic issues behind some of this immigration stuff. And we saw earlier this year that there were thoughts of moving a possible rail system that came from Mexico through Texas, one state over.
That's right.
If you're elected to take Senator Cruz's seat, how do you start kind of assuring our partners south of the border that we're ready to do business with them?
Yeah. Mexico is our biggest trading partner, and now it's the country's biggest trading partner. And it's incredibly important that we make sure that our economic ties remain strong. I actually was one of the guiding forces behind the passage of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement that updated NAFTA. And I recognize that trade between Mexico and Texas and between Mexico and the United States is incredibly important. What we're seeing is that when we take some of these extreme actions around shutting down the border or some of these things that I think lead business leaders and folks in Mexico to think, well, maybe we need to go around Texas, it's going to have an enormous economic impact for us. And so we have to stop some of this, I think, really unproductive grandstanding that we're seeing and actually have real solutions. And it's possible. As you said, after the expiration of Title 42, we have seen a drop in the number of crossings, but we can do this in a way that's consistent with our values. And I think that's really important. We're the United States of America. We are able to both secure our border and have a pathway for folks to apply for asylum that's consistent with who we are. It doesn't have to be something where we try and treat people in an inhumane way or impact our trade.
On the flip side of that, a lot of these folks that are coming over and applying for asylum, they're being brought here by coyotes or smugglers. We spoke with congressional candidate Michelle Vallejo earlier this summer, and one of the things we asked, because it's kind of being floated around, is there any thought that you have on granting or putting a federal terrorist designation on cartels in Mexico to kind of open up resources?
Yeah. Well, listen, I think we have to deal with this, but not by, as I've heard some Republicans say, sending in our special forces into Mexico and violating an ally's sovereignty or something like that. We do this by making the process much more transparent and clearer so that folks who want to apply for asylum don't feel like they have to go to a coyote. To me, that is one of the thing that's driving this is that the process is broken. Our immigration system is not working. And so folks feel like the only choice they have in some cases is to turn to some of these people. And so what we've put in place that I think we can build upon is some of these regional processing centers where you can make your asylum claims before you come to the border. We have an app and a website that you can use to make appointments so you can have your asylum claim heard. That to me is one of the reasons why we're seeing fewer of these crossings, is because people are starting to take advantage of that. So when we can get that information out there and combat some of the misinformation, we then, I think, take away some of the power of the coyotes and the human traffickers.
Switching to the economy, we know all the metrics show that the economy is starting to go in the right direction in the last couple months, but we still feel the pinch when we go to the grocery store, when we go to the gas station. You know, prices are coming down on some things, bringing that average down, but you know, the things that are important to everyday folks still kind of up there. What are your thoughts on finding a solution to bring down, you know, the food prices, the prices on staples that we use every day?
That's right. Well, you know, as I said, I was raised by a single mom who's a public school teacher, and so, you know, we struggled growing up, and I understand that when eggs are more expensive or gas is more expensive, it hits hardworking families the hardest. And it is good that inflation is down to around 3%, but we have to keep going on that. And the truth is, we did go through a global pandemic that upset all kinds of things in our economy, and we're still working our way out of it. And part of that is this inflation issue. And we're seeing that around the world. So what I've always tried to do is control costs where we can and make sure that our supply chains are strong. I refounded the Supply Chain Caucus. It's a bipartisan caucus to work on some of the bottlenecks that are holding us back and that do create some of these higher costs, but also controlling costs where we can. And that's particularly in healthcare and childcare. It's unacceptable that we still have the highest uninsured rate in the country here in Texas, but also the cost that folks are paying is unacceptable. I'm proud that we capped the cost of insulin for folks on Medicare at $35 a month. Unfortunately, Ted Cruz made sure that we couldn't do that for everyone. I want to make sure that we can lower costs across the board, make it easier for folks. And as we work through coming out of the pandemic, I think we'll see some of these things evening out.
You know, speaking of Senator Ted Cruz, you still got a primary opponent, at least one right now that you have to face before you get to Senator Cruz. Your primary opponent, staunch gun critic, especially after the Robb Elementary School shooting in Uvalde, which is in his district in the Texas Senate. If you win on to face Senator Cruz in the general election, that is definitely something he's going to come after you with, just like he did Congressman Beto O'Rourke, who narrowly lost to Ted Cruz back in 2018. How do you plan to pitch, or what are your thoughts on gun control, and how do you plan to pitch that in a statewide election in Texas?
Well, I grew up in a Texas where I think we believe in responsible gun ownership. You know, I went to a summer camp where we learned, along with sailing and canoeing, the riflery range, right? You know, and I think that's the Texas that I know, one where we are going to protect your Second Amendment rights, but we're going to do it in a way that's responsible and that doesn't lead us to having, you know, firearms in the hands of folks who shouldn't have them. And so that's why I've been working hard, and I'm proud that we did, for the first time in 30 years, pass legislation that John Cornyn helped lead in the Senate, the Safer Communities Act, to make some progress on this issue. And I think we need to have universal background checks. I think we need to, you know, raise the age for purchase of semi-automatic rifles to 21. And I also think the red flag laws have an important role to play. And I think safe storage is something we don't talk about very much, but that happens every day. I have small children. We hear a story about a small child who's shooting another one or shooting themselves because they got access to a gun they shouldn't have. So there are responsible steps that we can take that I think are fully consistent with the Second Amendment that also will save lives. And that's what I think Texans really believe in.
And one final question, and this one's actually coming from a viewer. I asked them last night if you had a chance to ask a Senate candidate one question, what would it be? And it's actually a pretty interesting question.
Sure.
As far as America goes, what is your biggest concern, and what do you think we can do to fix it?
It's a really good question. And my biggest concern is that I think the ties that bind us together are being strained, and that we are seeing each other, not as fellow Americans or as fellow Texans, but if we're on different sides politically, as enemies. And that led, I think, to January 6th, and I think that led to, and is leading to, some of the hyper-partisanship that we're seeing now. John Lewis, a colleague of mine, used to say, we came here on different ships, but we're in the same boat now. We're all Americans, and we have to remember that. We have to have leaders who encourage that and who talk about that, and who don't pit us against each other. And that's one of my biggest issues with Senator Cruz, is that he has used his time in the United States Senate to divide us and to take issues and pit Texans against each other and Americans against each other. I have a very different approach, and I believe in a very different way of serving, one that talks about our common values, the things that we share, because we do share a lot. And while we might disagree, there are so many things that Americans that are driven into us from a young age that we believe in. And those fundamental values are what have made us great, or going to make us great into the future.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your service.
I appreciate it. I appreciate it. Congressman Colin Allred running for the Democratic nomination for U.S. Senate. You can catch this full interview on krgv.com.